Okay, so today I'm going to finish the end of the Division 1 about truth and being just briefly because I rushed through it too fast. Not that I think that slowing it down is going to help very much. I mean, today I just should warn you, this is some of the most abstract and obscure and in a certain way hard because it seems to be saying the same thing over and over if you could only figure out what. And I don't claim to understand it very well after 30 years of reading it and teaching it. So don't feel bad if you don't understand it very well. And since you've got no exam to worry about, and you certainly don't have to get involved in these issues in your paper if you don't want to, everybody should just relax and enjoy the ride. So here we are at the end of Division 1, in which we're being told that something about the relation of primordial truth, which is, I'm just going to call it truth from now on, but remember there are two meanings of truth. The ordinary meaning when ontic propositions or assertions are about some ontic something or other. That's not what we're going to talk about. Primordial truth is in some way, surely, the background practices that make ontic truth possible. And the question is, how does that relate to being? So primordial truth is disclosedness, I take it. Or, I'm already puzzled before I realized I was going to be. I don't really know, and it may wobble in what I'm going to say, whether primordial truth is disclosedness or is, I think that's what it is. I was starting to say it's the practices that bring about disclosedness. But I think that the practices that bring about disclosedness is more like the understanding of being. But we'll get to that. Anyway, let's say primordial truth is disclosedness, that on the basis of which beings are uncovered as they are, and that it makes possible encountering anything. And being, now what is that? It's very close. It's that on the everything is on. We're all in the on the basis of which business, which I always think when you try to keep the phenomena in mind, and if you don't, you'll sort of lose your mind. So keep it, and I think the on the basis of which is always the background. And what exactly the background isn't obvious, but that's the job of the background, is to be in the background and be that on the basis of which something shows up in the foreground. So being is that on the basis of which beings are already understood. We've said that over and over at the bottom of page 25. I've tried to fill that in with a phenomenon. I would say being is background coping, or maybe more exactly, familiarity. Familiarity seems to be the name for the way the background practices add up to making things intelligible. That's the last thing. So being is that, remember, on the basis of which beings are already understood. That is, are intelligible, make sense. What is it on the basis of which beings are already understood and make sense? Well, it's, I take it, I hope, familiarity with how things go in the world and how to get around in the world and how to deal with chairs and doors and people and assertions and all that. That's all comes under being, or maybe understanding of being. I have a very hard time getting clear about the difference between being and the understanding of being. And so does Heidegger in a way, because every once in a while he'll be using one phrase or the other seemingly interchangeably. We may, if anybody has anything helpful to say about this, come to office hours and tell me about how to distinguish being from the understanding of being. My last office hours are this coming Wednesday, 2 to 4, as usual, and I hope to see some of the familiar people who come and tell me about things then. So both, and now how is truth and being going to be related? Well, there's a further sort of way they're related. They both depend on Dasein, and Dasein's taking a stand on its own being, that is, Dasein's coping, and that's what's happening here on page 272. We're now on the last 2 pages of Division 1. Division 1 has really done this whole story already, which we're going to hear about in Introduction 1 in a minute. And then he's summing it up, where it says 232 in the margin. The being of truth is connected primordially with Dasein, and only because Dasein is, as constituted by disclosedness, that is, by understanding. See, all these things to come together. Can anything like being be understood? Only so is it possible to understand being. It's tied up a lot with understanding. It's tied up a lot with Dasein's disclosing. I used to think, but I'll tell you now why I think it's wrong, that being equals intelligibility. I think being is close to has a lot to do with intelligibility, but being doesn't equal intelligibility for reasons I'll explain later. Right now, I just want to read the next sentence here. I think I did already last time. Being, not entities, is something which there is, in quotes, only insofar as truth is. That is what? That you can only understand everything and make sense of things on the basis of the fact that they're disclosed. So I think truth discloses them, and then being makes sense of them. These are all such sort of razor-thin distinctions that I'm not sure there are distinctions at all, but I have to keep saying them in the hope that I'll get clear about them and that you'll at least have something to go on. So I think truth is disclosing, and disclosing makes it possible to make sense of things, and being, which has to do with making sense of things, and is some way that we're familiar with. Being is, well, that on the basis of which being is understood. Whatever it is that forms the background which enables us to make sense of things, that's the job of being. And whatever opens up a world so that there is a background and there are things and we can make sense of them, the disclosing side of it is truth. So let's go on. Being, not entities, is something which there is only insofar as truth is, and truth is only insofar and as long as Dasein is. Being and truth are equiprimordial. Well, I've said the best I can about that. And I thought I would try to tell you in sort of really cryptic way what I think these with the 2 basic terms and one more, which is meaning, because you're always worrying about the meaning of being. That's another very abstract notion that's very close to both being and truth, because it's also that on the basis of which, etc. They're all on the basis of which business. That much is sure. On the basis of disclosedness, on the basis of familiarity, and now I think meaning is the formal on the basis of which structure, because meaning is the formal something or other on the basis of which anything shows up as anything. I wasn't going to read it. Now I want to read it. Help me find meaning in here. Did I write down when I wrote down? No, I just said, so meaning is right after understanding. So let's everybody find it for me. Here it is. Okay, meaning at the top of 193 is in italics, is on the basis of which, of a projection in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something. Boy, is that formal. So meaning is just the background, the structure of the background. That's the sense in which it's a formal something or other. Formal, by the way, never means something like informal logic, something present at hand and completely detached from the context. Formal means abstract, and boy, is this abstract. This is the most abstract existential framework story, and it's very similar to being, but I'll try to make the distinction this way. Meaning is the formal structure of all backgrounds, of all on the basis of which is. Being is the content of that formal structure. It's the background practices themselves, the actual practices, the familiarity, something like that, on the basis of which being's already understood. That's not formal anymore. I mean, that's what fills in the on the basis of which is familiarity. I think the nearest thing to doing the job of being is familiarity. I mean, think about that, about a room. What is it on the basis of which rooms and everything in the rooms are understood? Well, it's familiarity with rooms. And remember, Heidegger then goes and says, and moreover, we've got a familiarity with the world so that we can find our way around in the world. That would seem to me to be very close, at least, to what being's job is. And what is truth? Well, truth is the function of the background practices. So you got the form of them, that's meaning, the content of them is being. This is an attempt. Primordial truth is their function. What is their function? Well, it's disclosing. That's their job. So that all the other, so that there can be being and there can be meaning, and you've got to have a disclosing activity. And we are that disclosing activity. And we are this primordial truth. Dasein is in the truth. Dasein is in the truth business, I think that. He says Dasein is in the truth. That means Dasein is in the truth business. What is the truth business? It's disclosing. That's how he defines truth. It's opening up a space, a world, a clearing in which things can show up and be understood. Okay, now, I finished the Division 1 with that incomprehensible summary. That prepares you for the incomprehensible details which are in the first introduction. One of the morals of this is that it would be just insane to think that you could read this introduction, which is sort of starting right where we left off now, if you hadn't read all of Division 1 first. So that's why we read Division 1 first. And now we have a fighting chance of making some sense of the introduction. And we start on page 25, which is our favorite page, my favorite page, which is that at the bottom, remember. And we're going to ask, the introduction is going to ask about being. The name of this section on 24 is The Formal Structure of the Question of Being. And we're going to work out what is asked about, namely being, and now comes that which determines entities as entities, that on the basis of which entities are already understood. That's this very, if you just think of this as the background figure, the figure ground structure, that there's always a background on the basis of which there is a foreground. That's the phenomena behind all of this. I keep wanting to say you will lose your wits and it will just be spinning of fancy terms, as most books about Heidegger are, if you don't, as he says, if you don't pay attention to the phenomenon. And that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, now we have things get clear for a while, because now he's going to tell us what the wrong way to answer the question of being is. And that's kind of fun. What being isn't. That's what happens next. And he starts talking about that on 26. And it's just great what being isn't, because being isn't what all, in various ways, traditional metaphysicians have and theologians have thought being was, from Plato on, at least. I think strictly from Plato on. And what is that? Well, that's the idea that being is some kind of supreme being. Heidegger calls that ontotheology. That is, it's turning this onto, which is being, into a story about the supreme being. That could be God, but it could be the good in Plato, could be the transcendental unity of apperception in Kant, could be the master monad of keeping everything in order in Leibniz. There are all kinds of candidates in the tradition for that supreme being that sometimes they say created everything. That's the Hebrew supreme being. But sometimes in Plato, things have never been created. They've been there forever. But then in Plato, the supreme being is what makes things intelligible It gives out the light in which we can see things like the sun. And so all of those ways of thinking are wrong. And you're just supposed to think that, well, it's a big mistake. The tradition just got it wrong. And forget it. And go on and try to understand what they should have meant by being. But I better read you something. So that means if you are doing traditional metaphysical ontotheological stuff, then there's a beingist being that creates all the others, God, or makes them all intelligible, and I gave you a whole list of that. The important thing is to see that those are all ways of telling a story about tracing being back to some source that in some way produces it. That story he mentions on 26. I just want to tell you that's the wrong way to think about it. So right where we stop, it's the being of entities is not itself an entity. That's the top of 26. See, that's the mistake of ontotheology. The supreme being is a being, and being is what makes it possible for there to be beings and for us to encounter beings. Being can't be a being. So the being of entities is not itself an entity. If we are to understand the problem of being, our first philosophical step consists in not, I don't know what the Greek says, but the English says, in not telling a story. That is, tracing everything back to this source. That is to say, in not defining entities as entities by tracing them back to their origin, to some other entities, as if being had the character of some possible entity. So that's good. We get that out of the way. And there are other interesting mistakes. And so also, what being isn't is the totality of entities. And I don't know where he says this anywhere, but it's certainly clear that he believes this. And the totality of entities story leads you to the kind of question that, why is there something rather than nothing? And I tell you about that, not because he says that in here. He doesn't say that in here. That's why I'm telling you. Some very, I'm afraid, not very bright people, like George Steiner. I don't know, he may be bright about something else, but he's not bright about Heidegger. Thinks that the whole wonderful thing is that Heidegger has raised the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And he hasn't answered it, but at least he raised it. Well, he never raised it, and he certainly didn't answer it, because he doesn't think it's the right question. He goes on and on about why is there something rather than nothing in one of his books, and because he's talking about Leibniz. And he's talking about how traditional philosophers get themselves into this position of asking why there's something rather than nothing. Is this the best world, as in Leibniz, and God being good would naturally create the best world? That's one answer to why there's something rather than nothing. Heidegger doesn't have any answer to it. He doesn't think it makes any sense to ask that question. So don't read Steiner. That's I don't have him on my list, but it looks tempting, a nice little book that can explain all of Heidegger. So Heidegger now wants to get behind all these ontic misunderstandings of being. Another one, which now I'm going beyond just telling you what the book says, I think he also wants to get out of the idea that being is some kind of conceptual structure that makes there be a world by organizing everything. The Kantian story, we really haven't told the Kantian story. The transcendental unity of apperception is a sort of a super being, but it's not really a being. But what's really going on is the categories are organizing the world, and that might be the wrong. I mean, I'm worried about the bottom of 25. I worry about it every year, because the difference between Blattner and reading of Heidegger, of being in time and mind, everything hinges on a struggle between us over that sentence. I remember Blattner thinks that Heidegger is a Kantian idealist, and he thinks the evidence for that is the phrase, that which determines entities as entities. That's being. And that means being would be this conceptual structure that sort of puts a form on some kind of amorphousness, and I can't believe that that's what that first half of the sentence means. If it did, then that on the basis of which entities are already understood would be Kant's 12 categories, and that would make sense. You could read it that way. That's how Bill Blattner's going to read it. I want to say, no, that which determines entities as entities means that background which lets entities show up as foreground. I mean, it could mean that, and if it did mean that, then I'd be right, and he wouldn't be Heidegger wouldn't be a Kantian idealist, and Blattner would be sort of blaming him for having a view which he thinks Heidegger can't maintain because it's wrong, namely his temporal idealism. Now, when those of you who come on to the next time will see that there has to be a long, constant battle between whoever, me or you all, whoever's in the course, in Division 2, because Blattner's got this basically different, and I think wrong, view, and yet he's written the best book on being in time by far that anybody's ever written, so you have to sort of take the good and save it from maybe what's wrong. My only evidence that there's something wrong, but I have some, is on page 26. I mean, that which determines entities as entities had better not be a conceptual structure, because Heidegger specifically says that being is not a conceptual structure on 26. I'll show you. And the categories are, how many have had Kant? I forget. I hoped a lot of you. Well, the categories are a conceptual structure. And this is what he says on 26, which is, I take it on my side, the first full paragraph. Insofar as being constitutes what is asked about, and being means, well, that's not what I want. Let's see why I haven't found what I want. Around there somewhere is that it's not conceptual. Somebody find talk about conceptual. I've got it in the wrong page or something. Oh, here maybe. Maybe it's right up there. I think it is there, about 10 lines down. Accordingly, what is to be found out about by asking, namely the meaning of being, also demands that it be conceived in a way of its own, essentially contrasting with the concepts in which entities acquire their determinate significance. Pretty devastating to the Kantian reading. And determine is, I checked it, the German is the same as that which determines entities as entities. So it better be some other meaning of determines, because he says we're not going to talk about what gives entities their determinate significance. So then you have to reread what that phrase, what determines entities as entities, could mean. And I keep saying, try to think of it meaning that being is the background which lets entities show up as foreground, and then he says, namely, that on the basis of which beings are understood. So these two pieces of that important sentence fit together for me, whereas for Bill, they fit together for Bill too, unfortunately. You can read them either way. Yeah, Dave, yeah.
I don't understand how it's possible to be a Kantian idealist, because it doesn't come back to any kind of a transcendental subject.
That's a problem, isn't it?
That's a devastating problem.
How does Bill deal with it? Well, there is a transcendental subject, and this is something for next semester. Primordial temporality. Of course, it isn't a subject, but it's a transcendens überhaupt, sort of. It's not going to be a Kantian transcendental subject applying categories. And I see what you mean. Who could think it was? Whatever it is that you finally find out at the end of being in time is the meaning of being. It certainly doesn't seem like it could be.
There's transcendentality in a way, because there's that on the basis of which.
But it can't be. Well, how about can it be somehow the application of concepts, never mind who applies them. Somehow there are concepts around, and they structure the world. It's an added bonus to say that it's the transcendental subject that does it. But I don't know.
Well, then those concepts would be something thought as present at hand and so forth.
And it wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work.
Well, we'd have to go back and read Bill. Have you read Blattner?
A long time
Me too, a long time ago. Next semester we have to go back. I have to go back and look anyway and see how he manages to convince himself, careful reader that he is, that this is a kind of idealism of that sort. Yeah.
Well, one thing that might help is that oftentimes Heidegger, when he's talking about what he means by transcendental, refers to the medieval concept of transcending, which has nothing to do with Kantian transcendentality.
Yeah.
But it simply refers to the fact that the so-called transcendentals of being, that is the attributes of God, goodness, beauty, being, unity, transcend the status of being generic.
Yeah.
They run throughout every genus and every entity, but they are not themselves generic, which picks up on these comments which do come up explicitly about how Aristotle says that being is not a genus.
Yeah,
And then that's what he says. No, it transcends.
Yeah. I'm going to come to that, but I don't think that explains why Bill thinks that it's...
No, I think it's because he ignores that he wants to, that he has a greater tendency to interpret what Heidegger calls transcendental.
Because he ignores that. You've got a kind of tension in Being and Time, namely the devotion to Aristotle, which Heidegger had always, because Aristotle, as he says in Basic Problems, is the last of the great philosophers who can sort of pursue a problem in the face of the windiness of metaphysics and the wrongness of common sense. I'm just sort of paraphrasing it. So you read Aristotle to find out better than anybody except Heidegger. I mean, I'm talking how it looks to Heidegger. Aristotle better than anybody between Aristotle and Heidegger, who was trying to understand everyday experience and describe it not as it gets covered up in our falling and so forth, but describe it just as it is. And Aristotle also has, we'll see, important ideas about being that Heidegger also likes. But there's this tension, wait a second, between that and the fact that at the last minute Heidegger put all this Kantian terminology into the manuscript, where talking about the condition of the possibility of such and such is not at all an Aristotelian notion, I wouldn't think, and therefore, bong. And so Bill takes the Kantian stuff and runs with it. I tend to, go with the Aristotle side and keep trying to say, let's just look at common sense, everyday familiarity, it's hard enough. And nobody's been able to say much about it. Yeah.
So, on Heidegger's view, how can we make sense of assertions like there is God, there's an afterlife, there's those?
Well, how would we make sense of them? They're false. That's how we make sense of them.
But in your discussion, it seems like if there is something that a lot of people believe to be the case, how do you go about sifting through what is false and what is not?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Heidegger is so convinced that this is just totally wrong-headed, the whole ontotheological tradition, that I guess he doesn't really argue against it. He just, He just wants to describe our experience of the world and familiarity and what he calls being, and show, by describing that you don't have to bring in this supreme being who is going to be the source of it all, and sort of make this one kind of a very fast move. Well, surely we can't understand being as a being. That's what happens if you think of it in terms of God. Then we need something that makes even God show up and able to be an entity, and we don't have anything like that. So he thinks that, and I guess he would appeal to the fact that metaphysics has been in a kind of mess for 2,000 years, and that there are endless aporia, as he calls it. Metaphysics constantly gets into contradictions and problems. So Descartes can't get out of it, so Leibniz tries to fix it, but then Leibniz has trouble, Kant says, but Kant says, well, he's finally fixed it. And, of course, Hegel says Kant's messed it all up. He hasn't got it either, and so forth and so forth. I think Heidegger believes every one of them, one, that they've got something right, and two, that they're wrong. And two, that they've got it right that their predecessor is wrong, right up to Wittgenstein, who finally, just like Heidegger, says this is just the wrong way to think about it. Yes. I can hear you now. You just faded out. What?
Would this be the ground for Heidegger's kind of not agreeing with Kant, that Kant's whole framework is based on zero or dependence?
Well, it's just so complicated. I don't know what to say. Heidegger deals with Kant a lot in lectures, in several courses. I don't know how many, but 3 or 4 at least. And the whole courses on Kant. He takes Kant very seriously. You can see why he would, because after all, he thinks that Dasein does play a crucial role in disclosing, and Kant does think that we are disclosers, only he calls them transcendental subjects who apply the categories. Now, but I didn't mean to get back into this, and it doesn't prove that there's no God, of course, that Heidegger thinks that metaphysics is wrong, and it would have helped a lot if he'd said, I guess, more about it. But I think we're supposed to understand that he's very influenced by Nietzsche, too, and he's just going to get along without God and see how much he can explain without God, and he thinks he can explain everything that needs any explaining. I'm still worried about this, but I don't know what else to say. Yeah.
When you say that they're false, like statements that God exists are false, you mean they're not disclosing. Not that they're false in the sense that the metaphysicians would say that they're true.
Good. That helps. I mean, he's saying, although they couldn't be true. I mean, there's just no way you could understand that a being was a being. And in that sense, it's more like incoherent than false. Is that what you think? Or anyway, yeah, it covers up. All these are sort of assertions. I feel bad that we don't have any knockdown arguments. But of course, if there was a knockdown argument that there wasn't any supreme being, that would be a pretty important argument, and we would have to pay a lot of attention to it. Yeah.
It seems that the only sort of argument that he has is that if you think of being as a being, it's a kind of category mistake. Right?
That's right.
You take an instance of being and you infinitize it.
That's right. And you get these problems like if you try to tell a story and trace it back to its source, then people want to know, and what's the source of the source? The old puzzles. The old antinomies that Kant spells out. It seems Kant's the best person to go to. If you want arguments that traditional metaphysics is a completely hopeless situation in which there are at least 4 utterly contradictory theses at the basis of it, then you should look at what's called the antinomies in the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant's got arguments which I've discovered because, as I mentioned, every once in a while my son is now a sort of definitely preaching kind of Buddhist, and whenever he comes home he gives me stories about sounds just like Kant, about causality couldn't be a way things really are. Things are really empty. Space is incoherent. Time is incoherent. And they're very much like Kant's arguments. And of course, Buddhists don't believe in a supreme being either. So that I think it's no coincidence, but this isn't anything I can explain. Plato went away for a while and studied something called the mystery religions. And when he came back, he sounded a lot more like Buddhism than he did when he left, like he had a reincarnation of souls, for instance. So, but this is not what we're supposed to be talking about. So let's get back to this. Where am I? Okay, so we've got to get rid of. We're not going to talk about the source of beings, the totality of beings, which are running around forever, like in Plato. We're not going to talk about a basic conceptual structure, as in Kant. We're going to go on, and the next wrong answer is that being is what all beings have in common. We're going to go back to 22, where I jumped ahead because I wanted to tell you what was wrong before I tell you what's wrong with specific. He has a view about specific ways to try to deal with being, besides going to ontotheology and the supreme being story. And the first one on 22 is it's been maintained that being is the most universal concept. That's Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle is not a big fan of ontotheology. He sort of got a bit of it, probably because sort of undigested Plato. But he's much more interested in whether being could be a universal characteristic. What would that look like? Well, it would mean that there was something like beingness. And what would that be like? Well, you get this sort of story of a hierarchy where you can start, just for example, with collies, kind of dogs. But collies are kinds of dogs. So you go up to the next level, in which are all sorts of kinds of dogs. But then dogs are kind of mammals. So you go up to the next level, and that's a broader genus, mammals. And even broader genus is animals. And even broader is living things. And even broader than that is material things. And finally, you get to the most broad category of all. Everything has the property beingness, or belongs to the genus that beingness, and that's what. And now, why is that wrong? Well, that's what Adam was talking about. Heidegger talks about the same thing on page 22. Aristotle already knew that being couldn't be the supreme genus. That is the property that everything has insofar as it is, because being is used in all sorts of different ways. And the being of numbers, and the being of animals, and the being of, what else? Made objects like briefcases is different. And Aristotle saw that you couldn't say that they all had any common feature, a property. So he said being was being used analogically. This is at the middle of 22. The universality of being transcends any universality of genus. I like genus and species. I did up from genuses. In medieval ontology, being is dedicated as a transcendence. Aristotle knew the unity of this transcendental universal as a unity of analogy, in contrast to the multiplicity of the highest generic concepts available to things. So it's not a big high concept like material thing, or even broader, maybe entity. It's whatever it is, it can't do that job, and that's what's happening on 22 there, and he comes back to it on 26. That's what I was looking for, where he spells it out, the middle. Everything we talk about, everything we have in view, everything towards which we comport ourselves in any way is, I think to say is being is sort of weird, is. What we are is, and so is how we are. Being lies in the fact that something is, and in its being as it is, that is in reality, in presence at hand, in subsistence, that's what numbers do, in validity, in Heidegger, in Dasein, in the there is. And once you get that, you can, and in which entity is the meaning of being to be discerned? And the answer is there no privileged entity from which you can get the meaning of being. And so there goes that proposal. And then comes, but now, see, he's trying to get something right about each one of these wrong views. What's right about the view that being is what all beings have in common? Well, what's right about it is that Aristotle says there is nothing, that being is not what all beings have in common. So you've learned something. You avoid that one. That's all I think you can get out of that one. The next one is being can't be defined. Back to 23. That's number 2. It has been maintained, secondly, that the concept of being is indefinable. And what Heidegger wants to say about that is that just shows that being is not an entity. He says that they're onto something. The middle of that paragraph. We can infer only that being cannot have the character of an entity. Thus, we cannot apply to being the concept of definition as presented in traditional logic, which itself has its foundation in ancient ontology and which, within certain limits, provides a justifiable way of characterizing entities. It's okay to talk about trying to apply being as a concept, but you can't, because there's no way to define it, and That shows it's not an entity. That's fine. And now comes the more interesting one, the one he gets a lot of mileage out of. It's being is what is self-evident and taken for granted. Thirdly, it is held that being is, of all concepts, the one that is self-evident. And this is somehow both deeply wrong and got something right. And what is it that it's got wrong and got right? Well, what it's got wrong and right is that being is evident and obvious. And the point is, I think one way to put the point is, remember that being is that which is nearest to us and yet farthest away. So there's something that being captures something about us that's very important, but it's not self-evident. It's sort of structurally hidden from us what being is, even though we are it in some way. And it's hidden not only structurally, but by way of falling. Now, I don't want to talk about falling because I don't like falling, and I put it off till next semester. But the structural thing is important. Being is like the lighting in the room. Being has got to withdraw and not be obvious and evident for us to see and deal with beings. That's the figure ground idea again, only in Heidegger jargon, nearest to us and farthest away. That's because we're in it like a goldfish is in water. It's everywhere. We don't have any contrast class. We don't have any concept. We don't have any definition. Heidegger thinks they're on the right track, but they don't know what the right thing to say is. But this is, it's an enigma. What one should say, about 10 lines from the bottom. But here we have an average kind of intelligibility which demonstrates that being is unintelligible. That's the negative side. It makes manifest that in any way of comporting oneself toward entities as entities, even in any being towards entities as entities, there lies a priori an enigma. The very fact that we already live in an understanding of being and that the meaning of being is veiled in darkness proves that it is necessary in principle to raise the question again. So he uses this to say, well, we've got to start over. We obviously haven't got it. We haven't got it right yet. And in a certain sense, we must trust common sense where we begin, that being is the most self-evident, because that's where you have to begin. But on the other hand, you don't really want to trust common sense, because obviously it's got a covered-up view where everything is taken to be present at hand and where the background, which is necessarily structurally withdrawn and hidden, isn't taken account at all. So if you start with common sense, you've got to also understand that common sense is a kind of cover-up of being. And what are you going to do about that if you have to start with something that's wrong? And you know it's wrong, but you have no other place to start. Well, that's where he got into the state of mind of writing lots of stuff, which he got down to a few sentences in Being in Time, about, formal indication. You start, when you do phenomenology, you have to start with where you are, but then you investigate more and more and bring in more and more phenomena and so forth till you discover that almost surely where you started was wrong. In Being in Time, practically everything that he starts with turns out not to be what you normally thought it was. Understanding was something intellectual, it seems like, and yet it turns out to be a totally unintellectual way of coping. Truth, which looked like was correspondence, and then it turns out to be just the furthest thing from that, the background practices of disclosing. You'll see next semester, guilt turns out to be, looks like it means you owe somebody something, but in fact it doesn't mean anything like that at all. And death looks like a kind of event at the end of your life, what John Hoagland calls croaking, but it turns out that it's nothing to do with what happens to you on your deathbed, and so forth. So the whole structure of Heidegger is to take these common sense everyday notions, because that's where you have to start, and do so much describing that you finally you see they're wrong and that they're covering up something else. So that's what's happening here. So being is the most self-evident, and it is the most veiled in darkness. And Heidegger's got to have a method for getting it. Now, you'll see next time, by the way, of course, you're going to read Introduction 2. And Introduction 2 is going to define the phenomenological method. And the phenomenological method is going to be another way of talking about how to deal with what is somehow structurally and other ways invisible and make it visible. That's the job of phenomenology. Okay, let's see where we are. We live in it, we are it. It's presupposed in all intentionality, in perception, in thought. Did I read that already? I think I did. Yeah, it's all ways that we are directed toward entities is already somehow depends on being. And here he's saying that it's on 25 he says you can't trust common sense. So I'm trying to tell you both sides of this. It isn't as if he's confused. It's that the life is tough. So at the end of the second full paragraph on 25, we do not even know the horizon in terms of which being is to be grasped and fixed, but this vague average understanding of being is still a fact. See, that's where you have to start. That's the line I've been explaining. Even though it's a cover-up, when something is covered up, he says in somewhere, I think it's in the second introduction, that's already at least a hint of what it really is. If something is disguised and it's got a certain kind of disguise, that's already a place to start to figure out what it's hiding and why. That's a Heidegger idea. So on 25, you've got to start with where you are and the fact that you've got a vague average understanding of being. And on 28, he'll say, at the top of 28, being arises from the average understanding of being in which we always operate, and which in the end belongs to the essential constitution of Dasein. So there's the other side of it. Very bottom of 27, it really begins. This guiding activity of taking a look at being, now that doesn't change it any. So the tradition has always presupposed being. And then he says at the bottom of 27, this presupposing of being has rather the character of taking a look at it beforehand, so that in the light of it the entities presented to us get provisionally articulated in their being. That's what he's going to do. This guiding activity of taking a look at being arises from the average understanding and so forth. So you've got to, and then at the end of the paragraph, in answering the question of the meaning of being, the issue is not one of grounding something by such a derivation. That's the story again. It's rather one of laying bare the ground, laying bare the grounds for it and exhibiting them. It's pretty obscure. I wonder how the translation is. It is rather one of... I changed it in mine, and I don't know whether I did it from the translation or not. It is rather one of laying bare... It says laying bare the grounds for it. That is, the grounds for the question, the meaning of being, and exhibiting them. And I say what we're doing is not one of grounding something by a derivation, but rather one of laying bare the ground, and that all that other talk only makes it obscure. Have you got it, Eugene? You don't know where I am? Oh, you don't have the German. You have the German? Okay, I'm now on page 8, the end of the first long paragraph, which begins on page 8. Oh, it's in the footnote. Hooray, let's look. And what does it say in the footnote? Ausweisen Grundfreilegung geht. Let's see. Well, I guess the English is pretty good. So you're not trying to find a grounding for things. There is no grounding. Everything is ungrounded in Heidegger. But we want to lay bare the grounds for the understanding, the meaning of being and exhibiting them. That's pretty obscure. Do you understand it in German? I don't understand it in German or in English. But that's fair game for the first introduction. So just go on anyway. That's the only way to go do it. So now we're going to go through the way Heidegger distinguishes what is asked about and what the question is asked of and what it's asked for. What is asked for? Well, you can imagine already what is asked for is the meaning of being, but we've got to go through the first two. What is asked about and who you ask the question of, or what. It turns out to be who you ask the question of. So on 25 it starts back. We're always going over these same pages because they're all very, very condensed versions of this story. So on 25, again, this time, again, it's always about how this understanding of being is pervading everything we do. It makes us and everything else possible and makes sense, and yet it's invisible and withdrawn and covered up and so forth. So here we got it again at the second paragraph on 25. Inquiry as a kind of seeking must be guided beforehand by what is sought. So the meaning of being must already be available to us in some way. As we have intimated, we have always conducted our activities in an understanding of being. That's the common sense, we are it story, familiarity. We've always been, if you read it my way, which works pretty well, so we've always had this familiarity in the background, like the light in the room, where we're not paying any attention to familiarity. We're dealing with familiar things, but it's been there, and our activity's always been conducted in the light of this familiarity. Out of this understanding arise both the explicit question of the meaning of being and the tendency that leads us toward its conception. We do not know what being means, but even if we ask what is being, we keep within the understanding of the is, though we're unable to fix it conceptually. We do not even know the horizon in terms of which that meaning is to be grasped. That points ahead to Division 2 and to Introduction 2. You have to keep in mind that the horizon for understanding the meaning of being is temporality. That's why the book is called Being in Time, and that's what at this stage when he's writing the introduction, we don't know the horizon, which is the background, on the basis of which, or in terms of which, we can understand what being is, or understand being. It's so confusing to say what being is. But when we finally get to the end of Division 2, you will see, although we never get to the end of Division 2 because he breaks off, but when we get as far as the book gets, you will understand that the primordial temporality is that which will enable us to make sense of all modes of being. I mean, he's trying, if I'm right about this, and I haven't looked yet because I haven't thought about this since the last time I taught Division 2, I hadn't come up with this idea yet. If primordial temporality had better enable us to make sense of all the other modes of being, ready to hand, present at hand, subsistence, Dasein, and so forth, then it ought to be able to organize them so that you can tell which ones follow from which. It's going to give you a genealogy of them, and it also has to explain the unity of them, why they always have this threefold structure that keeps coming up. If it does all that, if primordial temporality, which you don't even know what it is yet, but when you find out, it's got to do all those jobs. If it's going to do the job it's supposed to do, give you the meaning of being. That is, give you the structure that makes this whole, that makes being, or something that you can understand, that you can make sense of. Okay, that's just jumping ahead. Let's go back to where we are. Anybody want to say anything? I have a feeling I've talked for too long. Nobody wants to say anything. You look like you might want to say something. No, you just want to scratch your head. Okay, then let's go on. So we need, and we dimly know the phenomenon. Okay, we're at that now. I'm going to try something. I wrote something here and then I bracketed it because I decided not to say it. But since we've got time, I think I'll try it and see what happens. Beings are intelligible. But remember I said I would explain why I was wrong when I used to think that intelligibility was the most general thing you could say about everything, and that therefore in effect, I was treating intelligibility as beingness, that every entity is intelligible in its own way. Math entities and animal entities and people entities and desks and so forth, they're all intelligible. So why isn't that a property of everything such that, but if it is, then I've discovered beingness, so there must be something wrong with that. Well, that's right, there's something wrong with it. Intelligible isn't an ordinary property. It's holistic. It isn't as if sort of everything has the property by itself of being intelligible, the way green things have the property of being green or being heavy. Things are only intelligible in a total holistic thing, like the referential totality in which hammers are intelligible. Intelligibility isn't a property of hammers. Weight is a property of hammers, and so forth. So then I thought, good. So intelligibility isn't like beingness, but it's still, then it's even better the right thing to say. Well, I think that's not right either. The trouble with intelligibility is that it seems you want to sort of ask, what's behind intelligibility? What is it on the basis of which things are intelligible? Because being ought to be, you keep getting this further and further back, more abstract. I think familiarity is more basic than intelligibility. I think things in a room are intelligible because we have a familiarity with rooms, and only insofar as we have a familiarity with rooms. So familiarity is certainly not a property, because things can have it and lose it, and we can gain it more by coping with things more. I wrote down something about that later. I want to go back and look at my last note, because I was writing about familiarity. I can't remember even whether I was being for or against it. I was torn about it. I think I'm for familiarity for the time being. Let me go on and see. Let's go back to where I was. Are any of you reading Taylor Carman on this business about being? Well, then I don't have to tell you. I think he's wrong, but I'll tell you just in case you ever do read him. He thinks that Heidegger is interested in the is of predication and the is of existence. That is, this is Brown, and this lectern just is. It exists. And Heidegger's interested in them. He's written about them and so forth. But it's not as if he's going to find out what is getting at. He's not going to get at being by thinking about predication and existence. And he doesn't. He definitely wants to get at something, because the tradition has talked about a lot about that. And okay, so what did I say about that? I thought I had a page number for that, but I guess I don't. But it's clear that Heidegger, I guess I just repeat, Heidegger doesn't think that being has to do either with predication or existence if being is that on the basis of which being is understood. The background and familiarity isn't a property you predicated something, and it isn't about the existence of something. So you can use being as a copula has to do with properties, and it has to do with existence, but it's not what Heidegger's interested in. It's just a special case. Things show up, and then they have properties, and then they either exist or they don't exist. But how do they show up at all? We're back to that again. Well, how come they're intelligible? And that's what he's interested in. So I think Taylor doesn't get it right. Yeah. That's what I was looking for in here and couldn't find. I swore I wrote it down. I have to reconstruct it. Put it on hold. I think if I just keep going, I will get to a point in which I try to distinguish familiarity from intelligibility. How did I, let me see if I can reconstruct it. Just a second. I doubt if I can, but let's see. Yeah, maybe it's this. I think that entities are intelligible, but I think that, yeah, now I remember. I wanted to say rooms aren't intelligible. Now I got it back. I think my computer dropped it. Somehow when rooms are familiar, that seems to be more basic than whatever it is that entities are intelligible, I think. But what we're looking for is always not entities or even properties of entities or even holistic properties of entities. I remember what I said now. Because there's something different, something less intellectual, something less aimed at entities, and that's what familiarity has in it. So it's a better way to think about it, and I give up my view that you should equate being with familiarity, with intelligibility. The nearest thing I ever come to is always saying the understanding of being is familiarity, and that's at least closer to what's behind it all. Remember, you want to. I'll try this. I haven't just thought that. If being is that on the basis of which beings are understood, then being can't be intelligibility. Intelligibility is what beings have got when they are understood, and we're looking for something behind it. That's good. That's helpful. If it's not down here, it should be. Yeah, Tyler. Which is more primordial? Familiarity and intelligibility, equiprimordial. Let me think about that. That's right. I was trying to say something like that, only spin it the other way. It seems to me there may be an order of priority. There's certainly, you can't have familiarity without intelligibility, or intelligibility without familiarity. But if you just, again, try to stick to common sense, it looks like the familiarity is more basic than the intelligibility. It's because you can find your way around in the world or in the room, particular entities become intelligible. And it seems to me that this finding your way around is what makes intelligibility possible, which makes it possible for things to show up as intelligible. But I agree with you that they're very, very close. You can't have a familiar room in which nothing is intelligible, and you couldn't have an intelligibility in a room in which nothing was familiar. I'm ready to make them, I'm almost ready to make them equal. I don't know how to describe, and therefore I don't know what to do, what I sense as the priority of familiarity. You both get a help here or hinder or whatever.
Think about like a Salvador Dali painting. You have intelligible things, but without any kind of familiar contact. Sort of absurdist.
I see, like a clock that's oozing over and so on.
It shows that familiarity is in some sense more basic than intelligibility.
Yeah, I sort of think things could be intelligible even in an unfamiliar setting, whereas anyway, go ahead, Curtis. I don't know.
I'm just curious if you would agree with me by saying paradigm is that which makes intelligible.
Yes.
Okay. And it seems like familiarity is kind of like built into the referential totality of the world.
Good. That's helpful. I think that's interesting. I mean, but that's both like what Tyler is saying and not, and that's why it's interesting. Because, since being in the world is such a together notion, it's no wonder they're equiprimordial. But when Heidegger has a choice, I think, of what's more equiprimordial than what, if you want to say it, funny way, then I think it's supposed to be the world. I mean, it's just one more move beyond having a subject that, and that's what you want to say too, isn't it? That we make things intelligible to us, but we do it on the background of, on the basis of having a world. I guess I want to say, yeah, intelligibility can't be a basis. We want to know what is the basis of things being intelligible, and then I want to say, well, that's on the background of a world, of course, and then Tyler comes in and rightly says, we are being in the world, you can't separate them, they are totally equiprimordial. And I want to say, yeah, but nonetheless, I think Heidegger has some sense that the world is the most basic. Yeah. 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 Well, but back to being. That on the basis of which beings are already understood. Why don't I just take my favorite sentence? Because if that says, what is it on the basis of which beings are intelligible? And that says that you've got to find something on the basis of which beings are understood. Chairs are intelligible and doors make sense and all that. And if you ask yourself, well, on the basis of what are things intelligible, there's only one answer that I can come up with, the phenomenon for, and that's familiarity. So then that on the basis of which things are intelligible, that on the basis of which things are already understood, is our ability to get around in and cope with everything in the world, or whatever we can. I like that. I don't know. I'm going to stop with that. I feel that that's getting it the way Heidegger wants it. Now let me see where we are. Okay, we get to my conclusion here, where I'm going to try to sum up what we've just been saying and go on to the next move, which is the move to Dasein, which also is in Division 1. So let's go on. Okay, being, I'm saying this over and over, partly to see if I can get it clear in my own head. Being is the background that makes all beings show up as intelligible. The background withdraws like the light in the room. We notice and have a language only for talking about what shows up as figure on the background. And that's why we end up talking about substances with properties. So Heidegger holds that we're socialized into the background by being given a basic know-how, which is our ability to find our way around in the world. And that's familiarity, and that's the bottom line. Now, I gave a new reference on 35. Is there something exciting on 35? Let's see. Not that I'm on 34 there. Oh, yeah, I don't know. I thought that helped a little with the very last line of the introduction. The question of being is nothing other than the radicalization of an essential tendency of being which belongs to Dasein itself, the pre-ontological understanding of being. What I want to say about that is we're always trying to make sense of things, and we always do it on a background and when we ask the question of the meaning of being, we're pushing ourselves to ask the question about the background, which is already there in our pre-ontological understanding. It's as if Heidegger's saying, if you want to raise the question of being, you have to take the familiarity, which you've already got, which is always in the background, like the light in the room, and talk about it. Then you're doing ontology. I think that's what that sentence says. The question of being is nothing other, that is asking the Heidegger question, the ontology question, is nothing other than the radicalization of an essential tendency of the being which belongs to Dasein, the pre-ontological understanding of being. So I'm saying it again. You've got a pre-ontological understanding of familiarity. What is it to radicalize it? It's to try to understand this background understanding of familiarity, how it is, what its structure is, how it works. That's what the book is going to do. Okay. Questions? As I said, this is going to be so abstract, and you've got all these things which seem to say the same thing. Maybe it's my fault. I've only got one sort of clue, so I keep saying it over and over. Where are we now? I'm saying again this over and over in my notes. We perceive on the basis of the background that the background isn't what we notice. And we don't have any vocabulary for talking about it, so the tradition has passed it over. But Heidegger says that oh yeah, now what? A new problem. Heidegger on 26 says that being is the being of entities. That sort of threw me. I mean, if that were right, then it would sound like intelligibility. Or you might say, well, being is the intelligibility of entities. But I suppose you could say, I don't think you can say familiarity of entities. So what's he doing when he says that? Let's look at it. I'm not sure I understand it. The first paragraph on 26. Insofar as being constitutes what is asked about, and being means the being of entities, then entities themselves turn out to be what is interrogated. We ask about entities to find out about being. I suppose that's right. We ask about hammering and so forth. We ask about all sorts of familiar stuff in order finally to get to the referential totality, and finally we end up with familiarity. So we start with the being of beings, but that which is asked about being means the being of beings. What can that? Being means the being of beings. Well, I think the wrong way to hear that is being means some general property of beings, like beingness, like intelligibility, like familiarity. That can't be right. Although familiarity is getting close to it. Maybe that is right. But I want to say, and I had another way of putting it. So let me look at this for a second. Dave, yeah.
If you substitute your term there, say, insofar as being constitutes what is asked about, and being means the familiarity of entities.
Does he say that?
No, that's what I'm saying. If you substitute your term,
Yeah.
it makes perfect sense.
Okay, good. Well, I like that. Where is that again?
I just substituted your term.
I see. And being means, okay. I think that's what I did. But I wrote that is intelligibility because that was my previous, that was last year. Yeah, now I think it's the familiarity of it. Therefore, I think that's right. Now let's see what I wrote here. Beingness is a general property. Because beingness is a general property, familiarity can't be a general property. And that's when I wrote down the familiarity of the world. Oh, and familiarity has this characteristic that Aristotle noticed about being, namely that different sorts of things have their own different sorts of being. So we've got the familiarity of the world, of rooms, of chairs, of other Daseins. That's not some genus that they all have. They're all species under the genus familiarity. That's something they all have, however, and they have it in some analogical way, I suppose, like being. I knew I'd written it down somewhere. Being is always the being of beings means not that being is some kind of general predicate beingness, nor not even a general characteristic like intelligibility, but being as the background familiarity that makes intelligible is, quote, only if there are entities that are being made intelligible. And that's what I think. If you want to talk more about being as the being of entities, then that means there have to be entities that are familiar and are intelligible. But then I tried, how about this very general formal way of talking about it? The background is always the background of some foreground. So that's a way of saying being is always the being of entities, namely being as the background familiarity is always the background for particular things to be in the foreground to be familiar. Again, I'm saying the same thing over and over. It drives me crazy, but I don't know what else to say except the one phenomenon that I see. So let me go on. Being is the background familiarity that opens the world and guides every way of dealing with entities. It's very closely related to disclosedness that way. And it turns out that we better, to understand more about being and familiarity, we should switch to thinking about disclosing and disclosedness. He makes that move by saying, and what entity are we going to ask about? Well, let's ask about Dasein. And now that you know where we end up at the end with truth and disclosedness, it turns out that it's Dasein that does the disclosing. So he shifts in the introduction to the question, I take it that's how it goes. It's disclosedness is a good name for the way the background is the background for some foreground, that is, lets things show up. And now Dasein does the disclosing. So let's go to that. We just have time. So what entity should we ask when we want to know about being? We should begin with Dasein, he says on 27. To work out the question at the very top of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in his own being. And so then, skipping a little, this entity with each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of its possibilities of its being, we're going to call Dasein. That's the first time he defines Dasein, and we skipped it, but we got it back on page 68 or whatever, 67, where he redefines Dasein. It turns out that this is not, that's a very fast move. In my commentary, I go on and on fussing about that, why he thinks that Dasein should be the privileged thing to think about. Why not look at artworks, which he did later, or nature, which he also did later, or things in the world of the primitives, which he also did later, ritual kind of things. So, but right now, he's thinking that's where he should look. But he writes a footnote at this point from later Heidegger, but the meaning of being is not drawn from this being, Dasein. That is, that's where he gets clearer and clearer that the world is even more basic. But now now I'm just sort of saying scattered things for a minute that are important and interesting. I would just got to call your attention to things in the introduction that I like. See, I don't have to really talk about Dasein, because we talked a lot about Dasein the first week of the course, and there's nothing new in here. But I want you to notice, because someday you may want to say this to somebody, how Kuhnian Heidegger is when he thinks about science. And he just throws this in, so I'll just throw it in. The third paragraph on 29. The real movement of the sciences takes place when their basic concepts undergo a more or less radical revision. Read Scientific Revolution in Kuhn, which is transparent to itself. The level which a science has reached is determined by how far it is capable of a crisis in its basic concepts. Do you see how amazingly Kuhnian? I mean, whereas you might think, and everybody did think before Kuhn, except for Heidegger, that the main thing, the more developed a science was, the less it was going to suddenly discover that everything it was saying was wrong, the way Newton was suddenly discovered by Einstein to be wrong. And people were worrying and worrying about how to fix it. The positivists thought they could make science so that it was so solid that it would never have to go through this kind of crisis and breakdown again. And the operationalists, when I was a graduate student, were trying to define the entities in science so we wouldn't ever have to redefine them. But Heidegger's got this great idea that science really progresses when there is this radical kind of breakdown, and you've got to be, and not every science can have a breakdown. Science has got to be normal science, to talk like Kuhn, if it's going to be able to have breakdowns. I mean, you can't have breakdowns in psychology and sociology because nobody agrees with what the basic principles are that could break down. But science got itself into this view in which, say, physics has a total view of how the universe works, and that total view can give rise to anomalies, and then it can be turn out to be wrong, and then we really learn something. Heidegger sees that, which is pretty amazing. That's because he was a science major once upon a time. And the other thing that he sees that's interesting here, I want to just give it, is, the other thing I want you to see is on 31, I mentioned it already, that he wants, what is he going to do in Being and Time? Well, one of the things he's going to do is a genealogy of the different ways of being. This is the middle of page 31. See, he's going to do what Aristotle couldn't do, show how all these ways of being fit together. He says it remains naive and opaque if it, that is ontology, in its researches into the being of entities, fails to discuss the meaning of being in general, Aristotle's question. and the ontological task of a genealogy of the different possible ways of being. And that's, you notice, he's doing it in front of you when he shows how the ready-to-hand is derived, the present at hand is derived from the ready-to-hand by two steps. First you get some breakdown and you get the unready-to-hand, which is still situational, but then you de-world or desituate and you get the present at hand, and maybe you do something else even and put it in a new theoretical construct, and then you get physics, which I think is where he calls its way of being is reality, and so forth. So Heidegger's got this interesting idea, which I think is important to people to follow up. You should do a genealogy of being. Now let me see. And if you do, I wrote down here, why is that important? Because then you'll see the limitations of cognitivism, which thinks it can start with the present at hand and just build things from there. If you understand how the present at hand is a privative form, genealogically descendant from the ready-to-hand, you won't think that. Well, okay, I'm finished. I didn't get to Dasein. There's nothing important there that we haven't got already. I just want to call your attention to, real fast, that he defines existentiel and existential on page 33. I felt bad because it doesn't ever get defined in the part I assigned you because it's already been defined there. So go back and fix your head by looking at page 33. Okay, next time, introduction 2.